The knock came at 6:15 in the morning, 3 sharp raps that pulled Jeffrey Lewis from dreams he wouldn't remember. May 14th, a Thursday that would split his life into before and after. The sheriff's deputy stood on the other side of the peeling apartment door, a young man with apologetic eyes and official papers that meant exactly what Jeffrey feared they meant. 72 hours. That's what the eviction notice said in typed letters that seemed too neat for what they represented. 3 days to vacate Unit 2B at Lancaster Heights, the 2-bedroom coffin where he and Andrew had learned to live small, to need less to survive on what most people threw away. $3,800 in back rent, 4 months of promises and explanations, and please just 1 more week's that had finally run out of traction with Mrs. Chen. No, Mrs. Henderson, the landlord whose patience had been extraordinary until it wasn't. Jeffrey took the papers with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't muscle memory from 3 years of holding steady when everything else fell apart. The deputy lingered half a second, maybe waiting for protest or pleading, but Jeffrey had nothing left to perform. Behind him, in the narrow hallway that smelled like old carpet and someone else's bacon, Andrew stood perfectly still in his Minecraft pajamas, 9 years old, and watching with eyes that processed information differently than other children's eyes. Not crying, not asking questions, just observing and cataloging and finding patterns in chaos, because that's what his brain did when the world stopped making sense. The deputy left. Jeffrey closed the door. Andrew went back to his room without a word, and Jeffrey stood there holding papers that weighed nothing and everything, thinking about how a man becomes a failure in increments so small he doesn't notice until the sum total arrives at his door with a badge and a deadline. 5 years ago, Jeffrey Lewis had been a senior technician at Hartwell Electronics, $58,000 a year, and health insurance that actually covered things respected by colleagues for diagnostic skills that bordered on intuitive. Then Jessica got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and kills faster, the kind that turns months into countdowns and savings accounts into dust. She fought for 18 months with chemotherapy that ravaged everything it touched, and Jeffrey fought beside her, watching his wife dissolve in hospital beds while their son learned to be quieter than any 9-year-old should have to be. When Jessica died on a Tuesday in March 3 years back, something in Jeffrey's wiring burned out too. He took bereavement leave that stretched and stretched until Hartwell's HR department sent the letter explaining that his position had been eliminated due to restructuring, which was corporate language for "we need someone who shows up." After that came the downward spiral disguised as surviving handyman jobs that paid cash, repair work for neighbors, anything that let him be home when Andrew got back from school because his son couldn't handle the chaos of after-school programs, couldn't process the noise and unpredictability of other children without melting down in ways that terrified the underpaid staff. Andrew had been diagnosed with Asperger's at age 6, back when they still called it that, before the spectrum swallowed all the specific labels into one broad categorization. High-functioning, the doctors said, which meant he could talk and learn and mostly navigate the world, but social cues bounced off him like sonar in the wrong frequency. Eye contact felt like violence to him. Unexpected changes in routine triggered shutdowns that could last hours. But give him a puzzle, a pattern, a system to decode, and something in that beautiful broken brain lit up with a clarity that made Jeffrey wonder who was really disabled in this equation. Emily Moore, Andrew's special education teacher, charged $400 a month for after-school sessions that kept the boy engaged and learning while Jeffrey cobbled together income from jobs that barely covered rent. $1,600 a month for the apartment, $400 for Emily, leaving $700 for food and utilities and everything else that life demanded. The math had been unsustainable from the start, a slow-motion collapse that Jeffrey had tried to outrun through denial and hope, and the magical thinking that somehow things would get better if he just worked harder. They hadn't gotten better. They'd gotten 72 hours to vacate. Jeffrey made breakfast because routine mattered to Andrew more than food. Scrambled eggs from the carton that claimed to be equivalent to 8 real eggs toast from bread that was one day from qualifying as stale orange juice watered down to stretch it through the week. Andrew sat at their thrift store table and ate with mechanical precision, sorting the eggs into quadrants on his plate before consuming them in a specific order that made sense to some internal logic Jeffrey had stopped trying to understand. The phone rang at 8:30, and Jeffrey knew before checking the caller ID that it would be Patricia Johnson, his late wife's mother, a woman who had tolerated Jeffrey when her daughter was alive and made no effort to hide her contempt after Jessica's funeral. He let it ring 4 times before answering, buying seconds he couldn't afford. Patricia's voice came through crisp and controlled the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Jeffrey will be there at 3 o'clock to pick up Andrew. Pack his things. We've made arrangements. Not a request. Not even a discussion. Just the announcement of a fait accompli delivered with the confidence of people who had lawyers and money and the unshakable certainty that they were right." Jeffrey's hand tightened on the phone. "We've talked about this, Patricia. Andrew stays with me. Don't be ridiculous. You're being evicted. You have no home, no stable income, no ability to provide for a child with special needs. We have the resources to give Andrew everything he deserves. Private school therapists, a future. What can you offer him? Homelessness." The words hit like fists because they contained enough truth to draw blood. Donald Thomas, Jessica's father and Patricia's husband, had built Thomas Industrial Group from a regional manufacturing firm into a mid-sized empire worth enough that eviction notices were abstract concepts they'd never encounter. They lived in a house with more bathrooms than Jeffrey had rooms, drove cars that cost more than he'd earned in the last 2 years combined, and they were offering Andrew a life that Jeffrey couldn't match on any practical metric. But Jessica had made him promise. In those last days when she was more morphine than woman, when the hospice bed had replaced their marriage bed and every breath was a negotiation with death, she'd gripped his hand with strength that came from somewhere beyond her dying body. "Don't let them take him," she'd whispered. "They'll turn him into something he's not. They'll try to fix him until he breaks. Promise me, Jeff. Promise me he stays with you no matter what." He'd promised. And now that promise was coming due with 72 hours on the clock and no visible path to keeping it. "I'm his father," Jeffrey said, and even he could hear how weak it sounded. "You're a man who can't pay rent," Patricia replied. 3 o'clock. "Jeffrey, don't make this harder than it needs to be." She disconnected. Jeffrey stood in his kitchen. That would stop being his kitchen in 3 days, looking at his son who was arranging toast crumbs into a geometric pattern on his plate, and felt the weight of every failure that had led to this moment. Andrew looked up, made eye contact for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. "We're not going with them, right?" His voice was flat, effectless, the way it got when he was processing stress through the firewall of his differently wired neurology. "Nobody. We're not going with them." "Good. I don't like their house. Too many mirrors. The reflections create recursive loops that hurt my brain." The second envelope arrived at 10:47, delivered by a courier who required Jeffrey's signature on a tablet that looked more expensive than anything Jeffrey owned. Law offices of Pemberton and Associates. The return address read a firm Jeffrey had never heard of in a city 2 hours south. He signed, tipped $1 he couldn't spare, and opened the envelope while Andrew worked on a 1,000-piece puzzle in the living room, a cityscape of Tokyo that he'd already completed twice and was now solving upside down as a self-imposed challenge. The letter inside was 2 pages of legal language that eventually crystallized into something approaching clarity. Jonathan Wright deceased. Estate settlement. Sole beneficiary. Jeffrey read it 3 times because the implications kept sliding away from comprehension like water from cupped hands. Jonathan Wright had been Jeffrey's grandfather. His father's father, a man Jeffrey had met exactly 3 times across 35 years of living. The first time at age 8 when Jonathan had visited for reasons never explained and taught Jeffrey how to use a hammer properly, how to drive nails straight and true. The second time at 16 when Jeffrey's father had dragged him to the old man's workshop for a weekend visit that consisted mostly of silence and the smell of soldering irons. The third time at 24 when Jeffrey had brought Jessica to meet the family she was marrying into, and Jonathan had looked at her with eyes that saw too much and said, "Your people come from different worlds, son. Be careful whose world you choose." Jeffrey's father had died in a car accident when Jeffrey was 19. Jonathan had sent flowers to the funeral but hadn't attended, and the two of them had exchanged maybe 5 phone calls in the 16 years since obligatory check-ins on holidays that neither of them believed in but performed anyway, because that's what family was supposed to do. The last call had been 3 Christmases ago, brief and awkward, and Jeffrey had assumed the old man was still alive, only because no one had told him otherwise. Apparently Jonathan Wright had died 6 months earlier, and apparently Jeffrey was the sole heir to an estate that included a house and 22 acres at 4782 Maple Ridge Road, valued for tax purposes at $63,000. The lawyer's letter was precise about the complications: property taxes in arrears to the tune of $18,400, mechanics liens totaling another $28,600 for work that had been contracted but never paid, and a document filed 8 months before Jonathan's death that granted Crestview Development Partners an option to purchase the entire property for $1 if all outstanding debts weren't satisfied within 90 days of the owner's death. Jeffrey did the math in his head. 6 months since Jonathan's death meant the 90-day window had opened 3 months ago. 60 days left. $47,000 in debts against a property worth $63,000 at best, and an option to purchase for $1 that would trigger automatically if Jeffrey couldn't come up with money he didn't have. Andrew appeared in his doorway, puzzle abandoned, drawn by some change in the room's emotional atmosphere that his unusual neurology could detect even when it couldn't understand. What's wrong? Jeffrey showed him the letter because lying to Andrew was pointless. The boy couldn't read social cues, but he could read intent with unsettling accuracy. Andrew scanned the document with eyes that moved in patterns Jeffrey had learned not to question. When he looked up, his face was doing the thing it did when he'd found something that didn't fit the expected pattern. This is a trap. The numbers are wrong. Look, property worth $63,000, debts equal $47,000, but the purchase option is $1. If they wanted the property, they'd offer market value minus debt. $16,000 would be rational. $1 is predatory. At 9 years old, Andrew could factor complex equations in his head, but couldn't remember to brush his teeth without 3 reminders. Could spot logical inconsistencies in legal documents, but couldn't understand why other kids didn't want to hear 30-minute explanations of Minecraft redstone circuits. Jeffrey looked at his son, this strange, brilliant, damaged gift Jessica had left him, and thought about how much the boy saw that Jeffrey missed. You're right. It's a trap. Question is who set it and why. Andrew pointed to a clause in the middle of page 2. This option was filed 8 months before grandfather Jonathan died. That means he signed it. Why would he give someone the right to buy his property for $1? Good question, buddy. Unless he didn't understand what he was signing, or unless he was forced. The thought landed like ice water. Jeffrey read the clause again, looking for dates and details. Signed August 7th of the previous year. Jonathan had died February 9th of this year, 6 months later, which meant the old man had signed away his property at a ruinous price, then died before the trap could close. Patricia Johnson called again at 11:30 the 3rd time that morning. Jeffrey, we've spoken with our attorney. We're filing for emergency custody this afternoon. Andrew will be placed in our care pending a full hearing. The social worker will arrive at 3 with police escort if necessary. Don't make this traumatic for him. Jeffrey hung up without responding, and for the first time in 3 years, something that wasn't exhaustion or despair moved through his chest. Anger, maybe, or the beginning of something like fighting back. Andrew was watching him with the intensity he usually reserved for puzzles. Are we going to lose? Not if I can help it. What's the probability we can help it? Jeffrey looked at his son, at those eyes that couldn't lie because they didn't understand how. Honestly, I don't know. But your mom made me promise to never give up on you. I intend to keep that promise. Andrew nodded once, processing. Then we need to go to 4782 Maple Ridge Road. The answer is probably there. The drive took 47 minutes through county roads that unwound into countryside. Jeffrey barely recognized, though he'd grown up maybe 30 miles from here. Subdivision developments gave way to actual farms. Strip malls dissolved into fields where cows regarded their passage with bovine indifference. The GPS on Jeffrey's phone His one remaining luxury, because finding work required being findable, led them down progressively smaller roads until they turned onto a gravel track that looked more like a suggestion than a driveway. 4782 Maple Ridge Road sat at the end of that track, a two-story farmhouse from the 1940s that had aged into something between character and collapse. The structure itself looked sound enough from the outside wood siding that needed paint, a roof with shingles in various states of surrender, windows that were boarded over with plywood that had weathered into gray anonymity. The surrounding land stretched in all directions, 22 acres of overgrown fields and scattered trees that had probably been beautiful once and might be beautiful again if anyone cared enough to try. Jeffrey parked in what might have been a turnaround. Andrew got out and immediately started walking the perimeter of the house counterclockwise, counting steps under his breath. Jeffrey tried the front door with the key the lawyer had included in the envelope, but the lock didn't turn. The key slid in but wouldn't engage, as if the tumblers had been changed or jammed or simply given up after years of disuse. The windows were all sealed from inside, the plywood nailed from within, like the house had been battened down against a storm that never ended. Jeffrey circled the structure testing boards looking for entry, while Andrew completed his perimeter count and announced 147 steps at standard pace, which means the house is roughly 3,800 square feet if we assume rectangular geometry, which is probably wrong. The workshop behind the main house was a separate structure, smaller but sturdier, built from concrete blocks with a corrugated metal roof. The door here was secured with a padlock that looked newer than anything else on the property, a Master Lock 6271 with weather-resistant housing and a shackle that would require bolt cutters Jeffrey didn't have. Andrew found the basement window by accident, drawn to the one section of foundation where weeds grew thicker than elsewhere. The window had been broken at some point, the glass knocked out, but the frame remaining now covered with a piece of cardboard that had rotted soft. He pulled the cardboard away and looked at Jeffrey with the expression that meant he'd solved the puzzle. 18 minutes later they were inside, Jeffrey having lowered Andrew through the window first and then contorted himself through an opening that was definitely not designed for adult male shoulders. They emerged into a basement that smelled like mold and old concrete, lit by whatever daylight filtered through the window they'd just violated. The house above was exactly what Andrew had predicted, professionally emptied. Not abandoned in the usual sense, where people leave behind the detritus of living old furniture, forgotten boxes, the archaeological layers of habitation. This was surgical removal. Every room on the first floor had been stripped to walls and floors, nothing remaining except the ghosts of where furniture had stood, evidenced by cleaner rectangles on the dusty floorboards. The kitchen had no appliances. The living room had one wooden chair pushed against the wall, orphaned and purposeless. The bedrooms upstairs were completely bare, not even curtain rods remaining on the windows. Someone had gone through this house and taken everything that could be taken, and they'd done it with the thoroughness of professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. Andrew was doing the thing where he touched walls and door frames, reading the space through tactile information Jeffrey couldn't interpret. Furniture removal patterns indicate systematic clearing, not casual abandonment. Weight distribution marks on the floor suggest heavy equipment was moved, probably within the last year, based on dust accumulation differential. Jeffrey stood in what had been his grandfather's house and felt the wrongness of it settle into his bones. Jonathan Wright had lived here for 50 years, maybe more, had raised Jeffrey's father in these rooms, had died in this house 6 months ago. And between his death and now, someone had erased every trace of his existence with professional efficiency. Why would someone clean out a house they were about to acquire for $1? Jeffrey asked the empty rooms. Andrew turned from examining scuff marks on the baseboard. Because they wanted something specific before the acquisition, something that might be discovered during normal estate processing. They needed to sanitize the scene. The basement yielded nothing except water damage and the corpses of insects. The attic was empty except for insulation and the promise of rodents. Jeffrey stood in the gutted living room while afternoon light slanted through boarded windows and tried to understand what he was supposed to do with this inheritance that felt more like a curse than a gift. His phone buzzed. Text from Patricia, social worker and police en route. Last chance to cooperate voluntarily. Andrew was at the window, peering through gaps in the plywood at something outside. "There's a woman watching us from the road." Jeffrey joined him at the window, following his son's sightline. At the edge of the property, maybe 200 yards distant, a woman stood beside a small sedan too far away for Jeffrey to make out features, but close enough to be clearly observing them. As they watched, the woman got back in her car and drove away slowly, like someone who wasn't worried about being noticed because they had every right to be there. The workshop door yielded to a crowbar Jeffrey found in the basement, the padlock's mounting hasp tearing free from wood that was more rot than substance. Inside, the space was less ransacked than the house, but still clearly picked over. A workbench ran along one wall, empty except for the permanent stains of decades of projects. Tools had been removed from a pegboard that still showed their outlines in cleaner paint. Filing cabinets stood open, and empty drawer after drawer of nothing. But in the corner, massive and immovable, was a gun safe from an era when gun safes were built like bank vaults. A Gardall 603, the kind that weighed 600 pounds empty and required explosives or expert cracking to defeat. The combination dial stared at Jeffrey like a challenge: 6 numbers, millions of possible combinations, 0 chances of guessing correctly. Andrew approached the safe with the focused intensity he brought to worthy puzzles. He pressed his ear against the door, spun the dial slowly, listened to tumblers that Jeffrey couldn't hear. After 3 minutes of this, he stepped back and shook his head. "I can't hear it clearly enough. But the dial has wear patterns. See? The numbers 7, 8, 2, and 4 have micro-scratches consistent with repeated use. The others are cleaner." Jeffrey looked and saw nothing, but Andrew's pattern recognition operated at a resolution normal eyes couldn't match. If those 4 numbers are in the combination, there are still 24 possible sequences. That's manageable. They spent the next hour methodically trying permutations: 7,824, 7,842, 7,284, 7,248, and on through all 24 possibilities, while the sun moved across the workshop floor and Jeffrey's phone accumulated increasingly threatening messages from Patricia's lawyer. When Andrew tried 782447 on the 19th attempt, the dial clicked differently, and Jeffrey felt something in his chest unlock along with the safe. Inside was not the treasure trove Jeffrey's desperate imagination had half conjured. No gold, no cash, no obviously valuable anything. Just a small cardboard box, water-damaged and soft, containing one notebook, leather-bound, roughly half of its pages, destroyed by water damage that had turned ink into abstract blurs. One micro SD card in a plastic case, the kind that held gigabytes in something smaller than a fingernail. One photograph faded but intact. Jonathan Wright standing beside a machine that looked like a large metal box with coils and displays, smiling the way people smile when they've accomplished something significant. One handwritten note on paper that had survived the water better than the notebook. The handwriting was Jonathan's. Jeffrey recognized it from birthday cards. They took everything. But they can't take what's in here. The note's arrow pointed to Jonathan's head in the photograph. Andrew picked up the notebook carefully, his fingers gentle with fragile things. "Most of it's destroyed, but I can read fragments. Look, ambient energy collection viable at 15 kilowatts sustained, and here, Williams threatened lawsuit if I don't sell. And here, Robert offered $2 million, but contract has poison pill." "Who's Williams?" Jeffrey asked. Andrew pointed to another fragment, Williams Energy Corporation. Then another, Robert Williams, board chairman. Jeffrey's stomach went cold. Robert Williams had been Jessica's grandfather, Patricia's father, the patriarch who'd built Williams Energy into a regional power company before dying 2 years ago. The man whose money had paid for Jessica's education, whose influence had secured Donald Thomas his first major contracts, whose legacy Jeffrey's in-laws treated like religious doctrine. Andrew was still reading fragments, piecing together a story from damaged pages. "My grandson must never know. Protect him from—" The water damage starts here and makes the rest illegible, but the implication is that someone needed protection from someone else. Jeffrey took the photograph, studied Jonathan's face from whenever this had been taken. His grandfather looked maybe 60 in the picture, which would put this 30 years ago or more. The machine beside him was clearly some kind of prototype covered in hand-lettered labels and analog gauges that belonged to an earlier era of engineering. "What were you working on?" Old man Jeffrey asked the photograph. Andrew had moved to the micro SD card, was examining it under the workshop's dusty light. This is encrypted. We'll need a computer and a password, but the storage capacity is 64 gigabytes. That's a lot of information for something this size. Jeffrey checked his phone, 4:47 p.m. Multiple missed calls from Patricia, 2 voicemails he hadn't listened to, and a text from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Lewis, this is Sarah Chen from Child Protective Services. I'm at your apartment with police escort. We need to speak immediately. They'd come. Patricia had actually done it, had sent the state to take his son because Jeffrey couldn't pay rent and didn't have solutions. The anger that had been building all day crystallized into something harder, something that felt almost like purpose. Look, Jeffrey said to Andrew, showing him the phone. Andrew read the message, his face doing nothing because his face never did much, but his hands started the stimming behavior that meant stress. Rapid finger tapping against his thighs in a rhythm only he could hear. We're not going back there, Andrew said. They'll take me. The pattern is obvious. We can't pay rent. They have resources. The state will rule in their favor. Probability of maintaining custody is less than 15%. The numbers felt right, even if Jeffrey didn't want to believe them. Then we don't go back. We stay here. This house has no electricity, no water, no furniture. The ambient temperature will drop below 60 degrees after sunset. This isn't sustainable. It doesn't have to be sustainable forever, buddy. It just has to be sustainable for tonight. They sat on the workshop floor while the sun set and Jeffrey's phone buzzed itself into irrelevance. Andrew went through the notebook page by page, documenting every readable fragment in his own notebook with the precise handwriting that made his schoolwork look like calligraphy. Jeffrey studied the photograph until the details became familiar. The way Jonathan stood with one hand on the machine like a proud parent. The workshop background that was recognizably this same room 30 years younger. The expression on his grandfather's face that Jeffrey had never seen in person. Joy, pride, hope. Everything that had been absent from their handful of interactions. The woman from earlier returned at 6:23 p.m., her sedan pulling up to the workshop with headlights that carved through the growing darkness. She was 70 or close to it, gray-haired and sturdy, moving with the confidence of someone on familiar ground. She knocked on the workshop's open door even though she could clearly see them inside. You must be Jeffrey. I'm Margaret Wilson. Lived down the road from Jonathan for 23 years. Her voice was kind but curious, the tone of someone who'd seen strange things happen and wanted to understand this new strange thing before judging it. Jeffrey stood suddenly aware of how they must look, father and son camping in an empty workshop, refugees from their own lives. Mrs. Wilson, we're not trespassing. I inherited this property from my grandfather. I know, dear. I was at the courthouse when they filed the estate papers. Small-town word travels. She looked at Andrew, who was studiously not making eye contact. And you must be the young man who's been giving his grandmother such concern. He's my son, Andrew. He's not going to his grandmother. He's staying with me. Margaret considered this, her eyes moving from Jeffrey's defensive posture to Andrew's deliberate focus on his notebook. Good. Patricia Johnson called me last week asking if I'd seen any activity at this property. She was very interested in whether Jonathan had stored anything valuable here before he passed. I told her I minded my own business, which is true, but I also kept my eyes open, which is also true. What did you see? Jeffrey asked. A moving truck came the week before Jonathan died, took away enough to fill the whole truck bed. I asked Jonathan about it, and he said he was putting things in storage for safekeeping. But Jonathan looked scared when he said it, and I was a nurse for 37 years. I know what fear looks like on a dying man's face. Andrew looked up from his notebook. Mr. Jonathan Wright died of a heart attack according to the death certificate, but he had a pacemaker installed 6 months before his death. Modern pacemakers have failure rates below 0.3% in the first year. The probability of natural cardiac arrest was statistically very low. Margaret's eyebrows rose. That's a sharp observation. Jonathan had that pacemaker put in last August, said it made him feel 20 years younger. Then February he's dead from heart failure. I thought it was odd, but I'm not a cardiologist. Did he have any visitors in the days before he died? Jeffrey asked. A few. Donald Thomas came by twice that last week, which was unusual because Donald and Jonathan didn't get along. Patricia never visited at all, but Donald did. They argued I could hear it from my place. Jonathan told him to leave, said some things about lawyers and threats and over my dead body. Jeffrey and Andrew exchanged glances. Then 3 days later, Jonathan was dead. Margaret nodded slowly. I'm not one for conspiracy thinking, but the timing struck me as convenient for some people. She reached into her purse, pulled out a business card. My son Gary is a private investigator, works mostly insurance fraud and missing persons, but he's good at finding truth when people want it hidden. I told him about Jonathan's death, and he's been looking into it on his own time. Call him. Tell him I sent you. The card read, Gary Young, licensed private investigator with a phone number and email address. Why would your son investigate my grandfather's death? Because Jonathan Wright saved my life 20 years ago. I had a reaction to anesthesia during surgery, went into cardiac arrest on the table. Jonathan was in the next room getting his appendix out, heard the code blue and donated blood when they found out I had a rare type and the hospital was out. He didn't know me, but he did it anyway. Gary knows that story. He knows we owe the man. Margaret handed Jeffrey a second business card, this one for her own number. You need help, you call. And you need to eat, you come to my place. It's the Blue Mobile Home half a mile down the road. I don't have much, but I have enough to share. She left them with the cards and the gathering darkness and the weight of implications that grew heavier with each new piece of information. Jeffrey's phone had finally stopped buzzing, which probably meant the police had either given up for the night or were planning something more serious for tomorrow. Andrew returned to the notebook, working by the light of Jeffrey's phone flashlight. I've reconstructed about 40% of the damaged content. The fragments tell a story. Grandfather Jonathan invented something called a harmonic energy resonance system between 1968 and 1973. It harvested electrical energy from ambient electromagnetic fields. He claims it could generate 15 kilowatts sustained, which is enough to power a house independently. That's impossible, Jeffrey said. The laws of physics say it's possible, but inefficient. Grandfather Jonathan claimed he solved the efficiency problem. He filed for patents in 1973, then entered into a development partnership with Williams Energy Corporation in 1974. But the notebook suggests the partnership was coerced. Williams threatened lawsuit over prior art claims, couldn't afford to fight them in court, accepted their terms because I had no choice. Jeffrey sat down on the concrete floor, the pieces arranging themselves into a picture he didn't want to see. So Robert Williams forced Jonathan into a partnership, took the technology, and then what never developed it. Andrew flipped pages carefully. There's a fragment from 1985. They buried it. 12 years and not a single product. I tried to sue but lost. No money for good lawyers. They have everything. Then the notebook jumps to recent entries last year. Donald came today. Wants me to sign away rights to the property. Says if I don't cooperate, they'll make things difficult. I'm too old to fight anymore. The photo of Jonathan and his machine felt different now, weighted with tragedy instead of triumph. A man who'd invented something revolutionary, had it stolen by people with more power and better lawyers, then watched them bury it to protect their existing business model. And 50 years later, those same people were trying to erase the last evidence of what they'd done. Jeffrey's phone buzzed one more time. Text from an unknown number. Mr. Lewis, this is Gary Young. My mother called. I've been investigating your grandfather's death. We need to talk urgently. I have information you'll want to see. Andrew was holding the micro SD card up to the light like it might reveal its secrets through pure scrutiny. The password has to be something Grandfather Jonathan wanted you to know. Not his birthday, not random numbers. Something personal, something that connects him to you. Jeffrey thought about their 3 meetings across 35 years. The hammer lesson when he was 8. The awkward workshop visit at 16. The warning about Jessica's family at 24. Not enough shared history to build meaningful codes, just fragments of relationships scattered across decades. Unless it wasn't about their relationship, unless it was about Jessica. Try June 12, 2012, Jeffrey said. Andrew looked at him with the question implied in the tilt of his head. Our wedding date, the only family event Jonathan ever attended. He drove 6 hours to be there, stayed for the ceremony, then left before the reception. He said something to me that day, something I didn't understand at the time. What did he say? Jeffrey closed his eyes, reaching back through 12 years of memory. He said, "Today matters more than the day you were born, Jeffrey. Today you chose family. Remember that choice when the other choice comes." Andrew's fingers were already tapping it into his phone. 06122-012. They'd need a computer to actually access the micro SD card, but knowing the password was half the battle. "The other choice is coming now," Andrew said. "It's been coming since we got the eviction notice. Grandfather Jonathan knew the family you married into would eventually force you to choose them or us." Jeffrey looked at his son in the dim workshop light, this brilliant, damaged boy who saw patterns in chaos and truth in data, who couldn't read social cues but could read human nature with frightening clarity. "I made my choice the day your mother died, buddy. I chose you. I choose you. Everything else is just details." They spent their first night in the empty farmhouse, sleeping in a second-floor bedroom with sleeping bags that had survived 3 years of camping trips that never happened. The house had no power, no heat, no water, except what came cold from the pump outside. But it had a roof, however questionable, and walls that mostly kept the May wind at bay, and most importantly, it had distance from the people who wanted to separate them. Jeffrey lay awake long after Andrew's breathing settled into sleep, rhythms staring at ceiling cracks that Andrew would probably count and categorize in the morning. $47,000 in debt against a property that would automatically transfer to Crestview Development in 56 days. An encrypted storage card that might contain evidence of corporate theft spanning 5 decades. A grandfather who died under suspicious circumstances just as he was being pressured to sign away his life's work. And somewhere out there, Donald Thomas and Patricia Johnson were planning their next move, backed by lawyers and money, and the confidence that Jeffrey Lewis was exactly what they'd always thought him, a failure who'd eventually collapse under pressure and give them what they wanted. They were probably right about the collapse part. Jeffrey had been collapsing in slow motion for 3 years, one failure stacking on another, until the whole structure was too unstable to stand. But they were wrong about what he'd give them. Jonathan Wright had spent 50 years protecting something he believed mattered more than his own comfort or success, had died protecting it if Margaret Wilson's suspicions were right, had arranged this inheritance not as a gift, but as a test. Could his grandson be trusted to finish what he'd started to fight? The fight he'd lost, Jeffrey had failed at most things since Jessica's death. Failed at keeping his job, his apartment, his financial stability. Failed at being the father. Andrew deserved the husband Jessica had believed in, the man he'd once imagined he might become. But here in this empty house at the end of a gravel road, with his son sleeping on the floor and the weight of impossible odds pressing down like atmospheric pressure, Jeffrey Lewis felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly, not optimism or confidence or any of the emotional states that people associated with fighting back. Just clarity. Just the simple recognition that some things mattered more than success or failure, and keeping Andrew safe was the only thing that actually mattered at all. Tomorrow, he'd call Gary Young. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to access the micro SD card. Tomorrow, he'd start assembling the pieces of whatever truth Jonathan had died protecting. But tonight he was a father sleeping on the floor of an inherited farmhouse with his son, and that was enough to build on. It had to be. Gary Young arrived at 7 the next morning in a Honda Accord that had seen better decades, carrying a laptop bag and the kind of tired eyes that came from working cases that didn't pay enough to justify the hours. He was shorter than Jeffrey expected, maybe 5'8", with the wiry build of someone who'd learned to be quick instead of strong. Margaret had said her son was 42, but the gray threading through his hair suggested the job aged you faster than calendars. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your grandfather's pacemaker sent telemetry data to his cardiologist's office every 6 hours, standard monitoring for his model. I pulled the records through a contact at the medical examiner's office. The last transmission before he died showed massive electromagnetic interference, the kind that would scramble the device's rhythm control completely. Andrew was eating cereal dry from the box because they had no milk, no bowls worth using, no anything except what they'd brought in Jeffrey's car. He looked up at Gary's words with the focus that meant his pattern recognition systems had just flagged something important. Pacemakers are shielded against normal electromagnetic fields. It would take significant localized interference to disrupt one, like an electromagnetic pulse generator. Gary pulled out his laptop, opened a file with photographs. I found this in the workshop yesterday after you left. Wedged behind the circuit breaker panel, probably fell there during installation. He turned the screen toward them, a small device, maybe the size of a deck of cards with exposed circuitry and a battery pack that looked professional grade. What is it? Jeffrey asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer. EMP generator, custom-built, commercially available components arranged to produce a focused pulse. Range may be 6 feet, strong enough to overwhelm pacemaker shielding at close proximity. Someone installed this near where your grandfather worked, timed it to trigger when he was alone. Murder, then. Not suspicion or theory, but actual premeditated murder. And Jeffrey was holding evidence of it in an encrypted storage device while the people responsible were trying to take his son through legal channels that would look entirely legitimate from the outside. Gary continued. I traced the moving company that cleared out Jonathan's house. The truck was rented to a shell corporation that dissolved 3 weeks after your grandfather's death. The company's registered agent was a lawyer who specializes in creating temporary business entities for clients who want anonymity. He won't talk, obviously, but the paper trail leads back through 2 more shell companies before hitting a wall. Dead end. Jeffrey felt the hope deflating before it had fully inflated. Not dead, just requires more work. But here's what I do have. Property records show that Crestview Development Partners has purchased 6 properties in this area over the last 18 months. All of them were bought from elderly owners, all at prices well above market value, and all of the original owners died within 6 months of selling. Andrew stopped mid-chew. 6 properties, 6 deaths, all elderly, all within the same time frame. That's not a pattern, that's a campaign. Gary nodded slowly, respect showing in the way he looked at the 9-year-old who talked like a forensic analyst. Exactly. And Crestview Development is a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings, which is owned by a private equity firm called Blackstone Ventures, which, if you dig deep enough, has board members who overlap with Williams Energy Corporation's leadership structure. The connections were there, but deliberately obscured. Corporate shells nested inside corporate shells like Matryoshka dolls designed to hide rather than reveal. Jeffrey's phone showed 8 missed calls from Patricia, 3 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 voicemail from someone claiming to be from Child Protective Services requesting immediate callback. Emily Moore showed up at 8:30 in a Subaru wagon with a bike rack and bumper stickers advocating for public education funding. She'd brought breakfast in paper bags from a drive-thru because Margaret had called her and explained the situation, and apparently the network of people who'd cared about Jonathan Wright was larger than Jeffrey had realized. Emily was 40 and looked it comfortably. No makeup, hair pulled back, functionally dressed like someone who spent her days with children who didn't care about appearances. She'd been Andrew's special education teacher for 2 years, the only one who'd figured out that his behavioral issues weren't defiance but sensory overload, that his refusal to make eye contact wasn't rudeness, but neurological wiring that made faces feel like staring into headlights. She found Andrew in the workshop surrounded by notebook pages he'd photographed and printed at Margaret's house the previous evening, arranging them in patterns that made sense to his particular cognitive architecture. How are you doing with all this chaos? Andrew? The chaos is external. Internal processing remains functional. I've reconstructed 42% of the damaged notebook content using water damage pattern analysis and contextual interpolation. Emily sat on the concrete floor beside him, something most adults wouldn't do, which was probably why Andrew tolerated her presence. Talk me through what you've found. Andrew's explanation was technical and detailed, following threads of Jonathan's research through fragmentary notes, electromagnetic field theory, resonance frequency, calculations, efficiency curves that showed how the system could harvest ambient energy from sources most people didn't know existed. Radio waves, power line radiation. The Earth's magnetic field itself, all of it leaking energy that dissipated uselessly into the environment unless you knew how to capture it. This isn't pseudoscience, Andrew concluded. The physics is sound. Grandfather Jonathan was solving an engineering problem, not inventing impossible technology. But the business implications would have been catastrophic for companies that profit from centralized power generation and distribution. Emily looked at the reconstructed pages with something like awe. Your grandfather was trying to make electrical independence possible for regular families. Jeffrey had been listening from the doorway, and Jessica's grandfather stole it to prevent exactly that. The words settled into the workshop's dusty air like sediment, heavy with implications that kept expanding the more Jeffrey understood them. Robert Williams hadn't just stolen technology for profit. He'd actively suppressed something that could have helped millions of people because helping people would have hurt his bottom line. And now Robert's son-in-law Donald was continuing the cover-up, trying to erase the last evidence before it could emerge to threaten the empire built on that original theft. Laura Clark arrived at 10:15 in a Tesla that seemed almost obscene, parked next to Jeffrey's 12-year-old Civic. She was Jessica's younger sister. Same dark hair and sharp cheekbones, but a fundamentally different person underneath the family resemblance. Where Jessica had been warm and open, Laura was contained and analytical, a child psychologist who'd learned to read what people didn't say by studying what they did. She'd married Timothy Clark 8 years ago, a civil litigation attorney who handled personal injury cases and contract disputes. Laura had called Timothy last night after Margaret reached out to her explaining that Jeffrey needed legal help he couldn't afford, and the situation was more complicated than a simple custody dispute. Laura handed Jeffrey a folder thick with printed emails. I broke into Dad's home office last night. These were in a locked file cabinet, and before you ask, yes, I know it's probably illegal, but they're planning to take Andrew and I couldn't sit by and watch. The emails started in 2019 correspondence between Donald Thomas and Robert Williams, back when Jessica's grandfather was still alive. The tone was casual, businesslike, discussing family matters and company strategy in the same thread. Then, October 2019, a message from Robert that made Jeffrey's hands shake as he read it. Donald concerned regarding Jay Wright's situation. He's still alive, still potentially problematic. While the 1985 court ruling settled, the patent matter physical evidence may exist that could reopen questions. Jessica's proximity to Wright through her husband creates risk of information transfer. Recommend monitoring and contingency planning. Jessica had died in March 2021, 16 months after that email. Her cancer had been aggressive. Yes, but the timeline between diagnosis and death had been extended by insurance delays that had seemed bureaucratic at the time, but looked different now through the lens of Donald's response to Robert's message. Understood. Will ensure appropriate delays in claim processing while maintaining plausible deniability. Medical group board oversight provides necessary leverage. Laura was watching Jeffrey's face as he read. Williams Medical Group handles insurance claim processing for the region. Dad's been on their board since 2018. Jessica's MRI approval was delayed 8 months while they requested additional documentation and second opinions and everything else they could think of. By the time she got the scan, the cancer had spread to her liver and lymph nodes. They killed her. The words came out flat, effectless, the same tone Andrew used when processing overwhelming information. Not with a weapon or poison, but by denying her the medical care that might have caught it early enough to matter. Timothy had been standing quietly near the door lawyer, observing rather than participating. What you're describing is conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, potentially negligent homicide. But proving intent versus incompetence is nearly impossible without explicit admission of intent. There's more. Laura pulled out another email, this one from 2 months ago. Dad and Robert discussing what to do about Andrew after establishing control. Robert's email was brief. Once custody is secured, ensure the boy has no contact with Wright property or associates. Any materials Wright may have left should be destroyed before probate completes. Our legal team can delay settlement indefinitely while we sanitize the location. Andrew had been listening with the stillness he got when processing threats he couldn't physically defend against. They wanted to take me to prevent me from accessing grandfather Jonathan's research. I'm the heir if Dad dies or becomes incompetent. They need to control me to control the inheritance. Laura knelt beside her nephew. Eye contact be damned. I'm not going to let them take you. That's why I'm here. Timothy and I talked about this all night, and we're prepared to testify against my parents if it comes to that. You'd lose your family, Andrew observed, stating fact without judgment. I already lost my sister because they put profit over her life. I won't lose you too. The micro SD card had been Jeffrey's obsession since yesterday, this tiny artifact that supposedly contained everything Jonathan had protected for 5 decades. Gary had brought an adapter that would let them access it on a laptop, and when they tried the wedding date as the password 06122012, the encryption unlocked with the anticlimactic ease of things that only seem complicated until you know the answer. 40 gigabytes of data flooded the screen in folders organized with the same methodical precision that had characterized everything else about Jonathan Wright. Patent applications, technical schematics, financial records, legal correspondence, and a folder labeled "For Jeffrey" that contained a single video file time-stamped 1 week before Jonathan's death. Gary connected the laptop to a portable speaker so they could all hear. Emily had Andrew sitting beside her, one hand on his shoulder, in case the content proved overwhelming. Laura and Timothy stood together, and Jeffrey pressed play with the feeling that whatever came next would change everything in ways he couldn't predict. Jonathan's face filled the screen, older and more worn than the photograph in the workshop, but unmistakably the same man. He sat in a room Jeffrey recognized as the farmhouse living room, back when it still had furniture, late afternoon light coming through windows that weren't yet boarded over. Jeffrey, if you're watching this, I'm dead, and I'm sorry. I should have been a better grandfather, should have been part of your life instead of staying away to protect you from what I knew. But I made choices I thought were right, and those choices led here. So let me explain what you've inherited and why it matters. The video was 18 minutes long, and by the time it ended, everyone in the workshop understood exactly what they were dealing with. Jonathan's explanation was methodical, building from first principles. In 1968, he'd begun researching electromagnetic energy harvesting while working as an electrical engineer for a regional utility company. The theory was sound ambient electromagnetic fields existed everywhere, radiating from power lines and radio transmitters and electronic devices, most of it wasted into the environment because nobody had figured out how to capture it efficiently. He'd spent 5 years developing a system that could harvest that energy, store it, and convert it to usable household current. By 1973, he had working prototypes that could generate 15 kilowatts, sustained enough to power an average home completely off-grid. He'd filed patent applications and prepared for commercialization, believing he'd created something revolutionary. That's when Robert Williams entered the picture. Williams Energy Corporation had been expanding aggressively through the early 70s, buying up smaller power companies and consolidating regional monopolies. When Jonathan's patent applications became public, Robert Williams recognized the threat immediately. Distributed energy generation would destroy the centralized utility model that his entire empire depended on. Robert couldn't legally steal the patents, they were already filed and published. But he could make commercial development impossible for an individual inventor without capital or connections. Williams Energy's lawyers filed challenge after challenge, claiming Jonathan's designs infringed on prior art, demanding expensive technical reviews, threatening endless litigation. Jonathan had maybe $40,000 saved, enough to defend against 1 or 2 challenges, but not the sustained legal assault Williams could afford. After 6 months of fighting, he was facing bankruptcy with nothing to show for 5 years of work. That's when Robert offered the deal. Progressive Energy Solutions, a Williams subsidiary, would partner with Jonathan to develop the technology. Jonathan would retain patent ownership, but Progressive would have exclusive rights for 20 years. In exchange, Jonathan would receive $500,000 up front and 5% royalties on any products sold. The contract had seemed generous at the time, a way to save his patents and still benefit from his invention. But the contract also specified that Progressive had to commercialize the technology within 10 years, or the exclusive rights would revert to Jonathan. Jonathan had signed in 1974, relieved to have the legal pressure lifted and the financial breathing room to continue his research. Progressive had paid the $500,000 as promised. Then they'd done exactly nothing. No products developed, no manufacturing planned, no commercialization attempted. Progressive Energy Solutions existed on paper, collected Jonathan's patents like trophies, and ensured that nobody else could develop the technology while the exclusive license remained in effect. By 1984, the 10-year deadline was approaching. Jonathan had documentation proving Progressive had failed to meet their contractual obligations. He'd hired a lawyer and filed suit to recover his rights. Williams Energy's legal team had destroyed him in court. They argued that Progressive Energy Solutions had ceased operations due to market conditions making the contract void, rather than defaulted. The judge had agreed, ruling that since Progressive no longer existed as a functioning company, the exclusive license was effectively terminated, but that Williams Energy, as Progressive's parent company, had acquired the patents through the dissolution process. Jonathan had lost everything: the patents, the rights, even the $500,000 he'd spent on legal fees and continued research. Williams Energy owned his life's work, and they'd made it clear they would bury him in legal motions if he tried to fight further. The video showed Jonathan's face as he recounted this history, and Jeffrey saw in his grandfather's eyes the same defeat he'd felt himself over the past 3 years, the exhaustion of fighting systems designed to crush people who couldn't afford better weapons. But Jonathan hadn't completely given up. He'd kept copies of everything: the original designs, the test results, the correspondence showing Williams Energy's deliberate suppression of viable technology. He'd updated the designs over the decades, improving efficiency and adapting to new materials. And he'd waited for the right moment to try again. That moment never came. Or rather, it came too late. The video shifted tone, Jonathan leaning closer to the camera with urgency replacing the measured recitation. 2 months ago, Donald Thomas came to see me. He knew about my research. Obviously, his father-in-law had spent 40 years ensuring nobody developed it. Donald wanted me to sign over the property rights, said he'd make things difficult if I refused. I told him no. This house, this land, these patents, they're all I have left to leave you, Jeffrey. But more than that, they're proof of what was stolen. Proof that greed buried something that could have helped millions of families. Donald wasn't pleased. He made threats veiled but clear. Then a week later, someone broke into my workshop. Didn't take anything, but I found a device installed near my work area. An electromagnetic pulse generator designed to interfere with pacemaker function. I removed it. I documented it. I prepared this recording because I know they'll try again, and next time they'll succeed. Jeffrey, you need to know about Jessica. I'm sorry to tell you this way, but she's gone and you deserve the truth. Her death wasn't natural. She had insurance through Williams Medical Group, a Williams Energy subsidiary. Donald sits on their board. Her cancer was treatable if caught early, but her MRI approval was delayed 8 months while they manufactured reasons to deny coverage. I tried to warn her. Called her in 2020, told her to switch insurance providers, but I couldn't explain why without revealing everything, and by the time she took my advice seriously, it was too late. They killed my granddaughter-in-law to protect their secrets, and I'll carry that guilt to my grave. Jonathan paused in the video, and Jeffrey could see tears tracking down the old man's face, grief mixing with rage and helplessness. Now they want Andrew. Not because they care about him, but because he's your heir. If you die, he inherits. If they control him, they control the evidence. Everything you need is on this drive. Patent applications that predate their claims. Financial records showing 50 years of licensing revenue from technology they stole. Communications proving deliberate suppression. And the technical designs themselves updated and ready for commercial development. I'm leaving this to you, not because I expect you to get rich from it, but because the truth matters. Because families deserve affordable energy independence. Because corporations shouldn't be allowed to steal from individuals and then murder to cover it up. Fight them, Jeffrey. Not for me, not even for yourself. Fight them because it's right and because some things matter more than survival. The video ended. The workshop was silent except for the laptop's cooling fan and Andrew's quiet breathing. Emily spoke first, her voice careful. That man entrusted you with evidence of corporate murder spanning 5 decades. Are you prepared for what fighting back will mean?" Jeffrey looked at his son, who was staring at the now blank laptop screen with the intensity he brought to puzzles he couldn't yet solve. Andrew had been processing the video's content through his particular cognitive filters, and when he finally spoke, it was with the precision that characterized all his thinking. The probability of winning a legal battle against Williams Energy Corporation and associated entities is approximately 12%, based on historical precedent for individual plaintiffs versus corporate defendants in IP theft cases. However, the probability of winning increases substantially if we can secure federal investigation and prosecution, which requires evidence of interstate commerce violations or RICO predicate offenses. Timothy had been taking notes on his phone throughout the video. Your grandfather documented conspiracy to commit fraud, deliberate suppression of patented technology, and insurance fraud leading to wrongful death. Any one of those would interest the FBI's white-collar crime division. All 3 together spanning this much time and money. They'll investigate. But first we need to protect the evidence and protect Andrew. Gary had his own laptop open, already copying the micro SD card's contents to multiple backup locations. If they figured out Jonathan documented everything, they'll come for these files. We need redundancy, and we need it somewhere they can't reach. Laura was looking at her phone, reading something that made her expression shift from concern to alarm. "Dad just texted. He's on his way here with lawyers. Says he's filing emergency custody papers this afternoon and wants to resolve this peacefully before it gets ugly." "How long do we have?" Jeffrey was already calculating distances and options. He's in Riverside, about 40 minutes away if he speeds. The text came through 6 minutes ago. Ryan Robinson's return felt inevitable in retrospect, though Jeffrey hadn't been expecting it quite this soon. The black Mercedes SUV that pulled up to the workshop at 11:30 was probably worth more than Jonathan's entire estate, and the man who emerged from it carried himself with the casual authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through presence alone. Robinson was mid-40s and expensively maintained suit without tie hair styled to look casually perfect. He'd brought 2 people with him, a woman in business attire carrying a briefcase, and a man who had security consultant written all over him despite the civilian clothes. "Mr. Lewis, I'm Ryan Robinson representing Crestview Development Partners. We met briefly yesterday, though you chose not to engage substantively at that time. I remember. You offered to buy this property for $50,000 after initially offering $175,000. Interesting negotiation strategy." Robinson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Market conditions change rapidly. I'm here to present a final offer before legal proceedings make voluntary settlement impossible. $100,000 cash for immediate transfer of all property rights and any materials or documents currently on the premises." The woman opened her briefcase, pulled out papers already prepared for signature. "We can close today. Money in your account by tomorrow morning. You and your son can relocate anywhere you choose. Start fresh without the burden of unsustainable debt." Andrew was standing slightly behind Jeffrey's hands, doing the rapid finger tapping that meant elevated stress levels. He spoke without looking at Robinson. "You've increased your offer from $50,000 to $100,000 in less than 24 hours. That's irrational, unless you have information suggesting the property's value exceeds our current assessment." What changed? Robinson's smile fractured slightly, surprise showing through practiced composure. "You're a perceptive young man. What changed is that my clients have decided to accelerate their timeline. Development opportunities in this area are time-sensitive." Jeffrey felt something click into place, understanding crystallizing. "You knew what Jonathan had here. That's why Crestview has been buying properties in this area, why they've been so aggressive. You're not developing anything. You're sanitizing the area before someone finds evidence of what Williams Energy did. I don't know what you're implying, but my clients are legitimate developers with approved zoning permits and commercial partnerships throughout the region." Timothy stepped forward, lawyer voice engaged. "Mr. Robinson, I'm Timothy Clark representing Mr. Lewis in this matter. Any further negotiations should go through me, and I should inform you that we're currently in possession of materials that may be relevant to ongoing federal investigations." Robinson's composure cracked visibly, his eyes hardening. That sounds remarkably like a threat, counselor. It's information. What you do with it is your choice. The security consultant was doing the thing that security consultants do visually, cataloging exits and potential threats, his attention lingering on Gary Young with the recognition of one professional assessing another. Robinson noticed the attention reassessed the situation playing out in ways he hadn't anticipated. Mr. Lewis, I'll be direct since subtlety seems unwelcome here. The people I represent have significant resources and limited patience. They're prepared to make your life extraordinarily difficult if you insist on maintaining control of this property. Legal challenges to the probate code enforcement actions tax audits. The machinery of institutional pressure can be overwhelming for individuals without comparable resources. Jeffrey had been scared for so long, scared of eviction, scared of losing Andrew, scared of every bill and deadline and threat that had defined his existence since Jessica's death. But somewhere in the last 24 hours the fear had transmuted into something harder, something that felt almost like the person he'd been before grief hollowed him out. Here's my counteroffer. Get off my property before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing and attempted extortion. Robinson's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. You're making a serious mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. The Mercedes departed with the kind of aggressive acceleration that threw gravel, and Jeffrey watched it disappear down the road with the certainty that he'd just made an enemy of people who played for keeps. Laura was already on her phone calling her father, trying to reach him before he arrived with lawyers and paperwork, buying time to figure out what to do next. Gary had his own phone out, dialing a number from memory. Special Agent Richard Miller, FBI, White Collar Crime Division, Riverside Field Office. I worked with him on a securities fraud case 3 years ago. He's straight, doesn't play politics, and he hates corporate criminals who think they're untouchable. The call went to voicemail, and Gary left a message summarizing the situation in terms designed to trigger law enforcement interest: multi-generational, IP theft, insurance fraud leading to wrongful death, conspiracy to commit murder, RICO predicate offenses spanning 5 decades. He ended with, I have documentary evidence and multiple witnesses. Call me. Emily had Andrew in the corner talking him through breathing exercises because the stress was pushing him toward shutdown. His hands had stopped the finger tapping and started the more concerning full-body rocking that meant sensory overload. She was patient, keeping her voice level and calm, creating an island of stability in the chaos. Laura got through to Donald. The conversation was brief and heated, her voice rising as she said things like, You murdered my sister, and I won't let you take her son, and I don't care about the family business. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. He's 30 minutes out. Says he has court orders granting emergency custody based on Jeffrey's inability to provide stable housing. The police are meeting him here to enforce the order. Timothy was already pulling up legal precedent on his phone. We can fight the custody order, but not immediately. Emergency orders like this are hard to overturn without a full hearing, which takes days or weeks to schedule. So they take Andrew today and we spend weeks trying to get him back. Jeffrey's voice came out rougher than intended, panic edging past the determination that had carried him through Robinson's confrontation. Unless we can demonstrate immediate danger to the child in their custody, yes, that's how emergency orders work. Andrew had heard this despite Emily's attempts to shelter him from the adult panic. His rocking had stopped, replaced by the eerie stillness that came over him when he was processing complex probability matrices. If they take me, they'll have physical custody and legal standing. The probability of you regaining custody drops below 8%. We need a different strategy. What strategy? Buddy Jeffrey felt like he was drowning, waves of consequence crashing faster than he could process them. We leave. Now. Before they arrive. We have the evidence copied to multiple locations. We have witnesses willing to testify. We have Gary's FBI contact. What we don't have is the ability to fight custody orders with 30 minutes and no legal standing. That's flight from legal authority, Timothy said carefully. It would strengthen their case that Jeffrey's an unfit parent. Staying strengthens their ability to control both of us. Andrew's logic was ruthless, unburdened by emotional considerations like how things looked or what people thought. If grandfather Jonathan was correct that they murdered him to prevent evidence from emerging, they'll prevent evidence from emerging again if they control me. Flight preserves options. Compliance eliminates them. Jeffrey looked at the people who'd assembled in this workshop to help him. Emily, who'd brought breakfast and breathing exercises. Laura, who'd betrayed her own parents. Timothy, who was risking his legal standing. Gary, who was investigating murder on behalf of a debt he'd inherited from his mother. And Andrew. Brilliant, broken Andrew, who could calculate probability matrices but couldn't understand why other kids didn't want to be friends. The weight of what running would mean settled over him. Fugitive status. Criminal charges, the permanent stain of being someone who'd fled from lawful authority. But Andrew was right about the math. Stay and lose certainly. Run and lose probably, but with a chance of fighting back. Gary made the decision easier. Miller just texted. He's interested. Wants to see the evidence. But he's in Los Angeles on another case, won't be back until Monday. Today is Friday, Laura said. 3 days before FBI involvement becomes possible. Andrew was already moving toward Jeffrey's car, carrying the laptop with Jonathan's files. We need to go now. The probability of successful exit decreases by approximately 15% for every additional minute we delay. Emily hugged Andrew briefly, quickly, respecting his boundaries even in crisis. You're a remarkable young man. Stay safe and know that what you're doing matters. Laura handed Jeffrey an envelope. Cash. $3,000. Timothy and I withdrew it this morning in case you needed help. Use it for motels, food, whatever you need until this gets resolved. Timothy added his own card to the envelope. My cell office line and email. I'll file motions delaying the custody proceedings, buy you as much time as I can. But Jeffrey, this only works if the FBI actually investigates. If they pass, you'll have run for nothing. Then I guess we better make sure the evidence is compelling enough that they can't pass. They left through the back property following dirt roads that connected to county routes that eventually led to highways. Jeffrey drove with no particular destination except away checking the rearview mirror for police cars that didn't materialize, while Andrew navigated using GPS coordinates he'd memorized from studying local maps. 20 miles from the farmhouse, Andrew spoke for the first time since they'd fled. Probability of successful outcome has increased to approximately 19%. Still unfavorable, but improving. What changed the odds? Where mobile evidence is secure in multiple locations. Laura and Timothy are creating legal delays, and the FBI is at least willing to review the case. Each of those factors independently carries low probability of success, but combined, they create paths that didn't exist before. Jeffrey drove in silence for another 5 miles, processing the fact that his 9-year-old son was calculating their chances of survival with the same emotional distance he'd use for a video game difficulty setting. Are you scared, buddy? Fear is an emotional response to perceived danger designed to trigger survival behaviors. I'm experiencing elevated cortisol levels consistent with stress, but my cognitive function remains within normal parameters for complex problem solving. So yes, technically scared, but functionally operational. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere in Jeffrey's chest, inappropriate and irrepressible. That's the most Andrew answer I've ever heard. Thank you. I try to be consistent. They stopped at a motel outside of Bakersfield, a place where cash was accepted and questions weren't asked. The room smelled like old cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but it had 2 beds and a door that locked and distance from people who wanted to separate them. Gary called at 6:15 p.m. Donald Thomas showed up with 3 lawyers and 2 sheriff's deputies. They searched the property, found it empty, and Donald lost his composure in ways I recorded on my phone. He threatened Laura with disinheritance, threatened Timothy with bar complaints, and threatened me with obstruction charges. The deputies looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene since no crime was actively being committed. Did they take anything Jeffrey was thinking about the workshop? The notebooks? The physical evidence they'd left behind? Couldn't. I'd already moved everything to a storage unit this morning after you shared the video. The farmhouse and workshop are empty except for furniture too worthless to steal. They left frustrated. The relief was physical tension releasing from muscles Jeffrey hadn't realized were clenched. What happens next? Donald's lawyers are filing interstate flight charges alleging you kidnapped Andrew in violation of emergency custody orders. It won't stick, you're Andrew's legal parent, and the custody order wasn't finalized, but it creates paperwork and complications. Timothy's working on that. In the meantime, you stay mobile, stay quiet, and wait for Miller to review the evidence. I'm meeting with him Monday morning to walk through everything Jonathan documented. Jeffrey hung up and found Andrew sitting cross-legged on the bed working through the micro SD card files on the laptop, building a timeline of Williams Energy's theft with the methodical precision of someone assembling evidence for prosecution. The legal case is strong, Andrew said without looking up. 50 years of documentation showing deliberate suppression of viable technology, multiple instances of fraud conspiracy to commit murder. The challenge is getting prosecutors to commit resources to a case against defendants with infinite legal budgets, so we make it impossible for them to ignore. Andrew looked up, made eye contact for exactly 3 seconds. His way of showing this was important. Grandfather Jonathan spent 50 years collecting proof. Mom died because they delayed her insurance. You lost everything because the system protects people with money. The pattern is clear. Institutions serve power, not justice. We need to make justice the path of least resistance. Jeffrey had no idea how to do that, but watching his son, this brilliant, damaged, extraordinary boy who saw patterns in chaos and truth in data, he felt something shift in his understanding of what fighting back meant. Jonathan had fought alone and lost, but Jeffrey wasn't alone. He had Andrew's mind, Gary's investigation, Laura's betrayal of her own family, Timothy's legal maneuvering, Emily's support, and somewhere in Los Angeles, an FBI agent who might actually care about evidence. Not alone, not hopeless, just outnumbered and outgunned, which was different from defeated. They ordered pizza because Andrew needed routine and predictability, watched television without absorbing content, and eventually slept in shifts because paranoia made rest impossible. Somewhere Donald Thomas was mobilizing resources. Somewhere Ryan Robinson was reporting failure to clients who didn't accept failure gracefully. Somewhere wheels were turning to crush 2 people who'd chosen to fight instead of surrendering. But somewhere else, in storage units and backup drives and Laura's testimony and Gary's investigation, the truth was assembling itself into something that couldn't be buried, no matter how much money tried to dig the grave. Jeffrey lay awake in the motel darkness, listening to Andrew's breathing settle into sleep. Rhythms, thinking about Jonathan's final message. Fight them because it's right and because some things matter more than survival. He'd spent 3 years just surviving, measuring success in days without disaster. Maybe it was time to remember that some things were worth the risk of losing everything, because living in fear wasn't living at all. Monday would bring the FBI or it wouldn't. The legal system would deliver justice or it wouldn't. Williams Energy would bury the evidence or they wouldn't. But Jeffrey Lewis would fight because his son was worth fighting for, because his wife had died asking him to, because his grandfather had spent 50 years protecting truth that mattered more than comfort. And sometimes that had to be enough to start with. Monday morning arrived with Special Agent Richard Miller's call at 6:47 a.m., his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who'd already consumed too much coffee and not enough sleep. I've reviewed the preliminary materials Gary Young sent. This warrants a face-to-face. Can you be in Riverside by noon? Jeffrey had been awake since 4, watching Andrew sleep, while running scenarios that all ended badly until this one phone call shifted the probability matrix. We'll be there. The FBI field office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that proclaimed federal authority through architectural severity. Miller met them in a conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and recirculated air, a man in his late 40s with gray threading through dark hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many people get away with too much. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your grandfather documented 53 years of corporate malfeasance with the kind of detail that makes prosecutors weep. Patent theft, systematic technology suppression, insurance fraud, leading to wrongful death, and evidence suggesting conspiracy to commit murder. The question isn't whether crimes were committed. The question is whether we can prove them to a jury's satisfaction. Andrew had brought the laptop containing Jonathan's files, and over the next 2 hours he walked Miller through the evidence with the methodical precision that made him simultaneously brilliant and exhausting to be around. Every claim supported by documentation, every allegation backed by contemporaneous records, every connection traced through corporate filings that most people wouldn't have the patience or skill to unravel. Miller took notes in a leather-bound book, old school, despite the laptop open in front of him. When Andrew finished, the agent sat back and studied them both with the calculating gaze of someone deciding how much truth to share. This is substantial. Multiple RICO predicates interstate commerce violations enough to justify a full investigation. But you need to understand what you're starting. Williams Energy Corporation has resources that make small nations jealous. Their legal team will fight every subpoena challenge, every warrant delay, every deposition. We're looking at 18 months minimum before trial, possibly 3 years. Jeffrey felt the timeline stretch ahead, 3 years of running and hiding and watching Andrew grow up in motel rooms while lawyers argued procedure. Can we protect Andrew during that time? That's complicated. Miller's expression suggested he'd already wargamed this scenario. The emergency custody order Donald Thomas obtained was procedurally questionable, issued by a judge who's received campaign contributions from Thomas Industrial Group's PAC. We can challenge it, but family court moves slowly and doesn't care much about federal investigations in progress, so they could still take him while you build your case. The fear Jeffrey had been holding at bay since Friday crashed back cold and suffocating. Potentially, unless we demonstrate immediate danger to the child in their custody. He looked at Andrew, who was reorganizing Miller's business cards by color and texture, oblivious to being discussed. Your son has special needs. Do Donald and Patricia Thomas have experience managing autism spectrum disorders? Number Jessica handled all of Andrew's therapy and education. After she died, I learned as I went. Miller made another note. That's a wedge. We can argue that removing Andrew from his primary caregiver, especially one who understands his neurological needs, constitutes harm. It's not perfect, but it gives us standing to delay until the criminal investigation produces actionable intelligence. Timothy had been right about Miller. The man was straight, didn't play politics, and approached corporate crime with the focused intensity of someone who'd made it personal. Jeffrey watched him work through the evidence, building mental frameworks for prosecution, and felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become hope. The call from Donald Thomas came at 2:17 p.m., while Jeffrey and Andrew were eating lunch at a diner 3 blocks from the FBI office. The number displayed is unknown, but Jeffrey had been expecting this contact since they'd fled Friday, so he answered. Jeffrey. Donald's voice carried the forced calm of someone working hard to control anger. We need to talk. Private. Just the two of us. I'm done with private conversations that end with you trying to take my son. I'm not trying to take Andrew. I'm trying to protect him from a situation you've created. You're a fugitive now, Jeffrey. Interstate flight, contempt of court, parental kidnapping. You're accumulating charges that will destroy any custody claim you have left. The FBI disagrees with your assessment. Silence stretched long enough that Jeffrey checked the phone to confirm the connection hadn't dropped. When Donald spoke again, his voice had shifted to something harder, more calculating. You've been to the FBI. Of course you have. Gary Young and his conspiracy theories, Laura's betrayal, all of it packaged for federal consumption. And what did they tell you? That they'll investigate. That justice will prevail. They'll investigate for years while you hide in motels, and Andrew misses school and therapy. Is that the life you want for him? What life do you want for him, Donald? One where he learns that family means nothing when money's at stake, where his mother's death gets filed under acceptable losses. Jessica's death was tragedy, not conspiracy. But if you want to discuss what really happened, we should do it face to face. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., the Riverside Marriott. Come alone or bring lawyers, your choice. But come because I have information you'll want to hear. The meeting felt like walking into ambush, but Jeffrey went anyway because Donald was right about one thing. Hiding indefinitely wasn't sustainable. Timothy accompanied him, positioning the meeting as preliminary settlement discussion rather than capitulation, creating legal cover if things went wrong. Donald had reserved a conference room, and he sat alone at the table when they arrived. No lawyers, no Patricia, no muscle. Just Jessica's father, looking older than Jeffrey remembered, stress showing in new lines around his eyes and gray that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Thank you for coming." Donald gestured to chairs across from him. "I know you don't trust me, and frankly you shouldn't, but I'm here to offer you something I should have offered years ago. Truth." Timothy pulled out a recorder. "This conversation is being documented for potential legal use. I expected nothing less." Donald folded his hands on the table, composure cracking just enough to show exhaustion underneath. "Jeffrey, I'm going to tell you things that make me look monstrous because I've been acting like a monster. But before I do, I want you to understand that everything, absolutely everything I've done, has been in service of protecting what Robert Williams built. Not the company, not the money. The empire of control he established over anything that threatened his vision of how energy should flow in this country. That's not a defense, Donald. That's admission. It's context. In 1974, Robert Williams recognized that Jonathan Wright's technology would destroy the centralized utility model. Not might destroy, would destroy inevitably if it reached commercial scale. So Robert stole it, buried it, and spent 50 years ensuring nobody else could develop distributed energy systems that would free households from grid dependence. Andrew was listening with focused intensity, recording every word in the eidetic memory that made him simultaneously gifted and isolated. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because Robert Williams is dead, and I'm tired of protecting his legacy at the cost of my own soul." Donald pulled out a small device, a digital recorder that looked expensive and professional. 2 weeks before he died, Robert recorded a confession. He was dying, knew it, and wanted to unburden himself before the end. He gave this to me with instructions to destroy it. I couldn't, and now I'm giving it to you. He slid the recorder across the table. Timothy picked it up, examined it for authenticity, then nodded to Jeffrey. "What's on it?" Jeffrey's voice came out rougher than intended. "Everything. Robert admitting to patent theft, technology suppression, deliberate sabotage of Jonathan's legal challenges, even the insurance delays that killed Jessica. He was lucid, detailed, and absolutely damning. It's a federal prosecutor's dream evidence. Then why give it to us instead of destroying it like he asked?" Donald's composure finally broke, grief and guilt flooding through. "Because Jessica knew. She found out about Jonathan's research 6 months before she died. Called me, asked questions I couldn't answer without revealing the whole conspiracy. I tried to protect her by stonewalling, but she kept digging. Then her MRI requests started getting denied, and I didn't connect it fast enough. Didn't realize Robert's protection extended to eliminating threats, even when the threat was my own daughter." The revelation hung in air, thick with implications. Jessica had been trying to help Jonathan, had been killed for it, and her own father had participated in the system that murdered her through bureaucratic delay. She was going to help him file a new lawsuit, wasn't she? Jeffrey heard his own voice from far away, detached from the body, speaking. She was compiling evidence, talking to patent lawyers, planning to fund Jonathan's legal fees from her inheritance. And Robert's people were monitoring her because she'd married into the family and represented unknown risk. When they realized what she was doing, the delays started. I found out too late to stop it, and by then, the cancer had spread beyond treatment. Timothy's voice was flat prosecutorial. "Yes." Donald's hands were shaking now, the veneer of control completely stripped away. "I've spent 2 years trying to rationalize it, telling myself it was coincidence, bureaucratic incompetence, anything but deliberate murder. But this recording, Robert admits it. Says he gave the order to delay her coverage until the threat was neutralized. Those were his words. Neutralized." Jeffrey felt rage building in his chest, hot and violent, the kind that made hands clench and vision narrow. "You knew. For 2 years you knew they killed her, and you helped them try to take Andrew. I didn't help them. I was trying to protect him. If you exposed this, if you fought back, they'd eliminate you too. I thought if I could get Andrew into our custody, keep him away from the evidence, he'd be safe from the same people who killed his mother." The logic was twisted but comprehensible, a father trying to save his grandson by sacrificing his son-in-law protection through compliance rather than resistance. Jeffrey looked at Donald Thomas and saw not a monster, but a broken man who'd made terrible choices in service of impossible situations. This doesn't absolve you. Timothy was already calculating how to use the confession. You participated in covering up your daughter's murder. I know. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm giving you the weapon to destroy everything Robert built. Donald stood, moved toward the door, then paused. The emergency custody order, I'm withdrawing it this afternoon. Andrew stays with you. And when the FBI comes for me, because they will after you play that recording, I won't fight extradition or hire lawyers to delay. I'll cooperate fully with prosecution. Why the change of heart? Jeffrey needed to understand this pivot from antagonist to ally. Because I watched my daughter die protecting truth, and I've spent 2 years protecting lies. It's time to choose which legacy matters more, Robert's empire or Jessica's integrity. Donald left them with the recording and the weight of revelations that changed everything. Timothy immediately called Miller, arranged to hand over the confession as evidence, and started drafting motions to formalize Andrew's custody status now that Donald had withdrawn opposition. Andrew had been silent throughout the meeting, processing information through neural pathways that turned emotion into data and data into understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone stating observable fact. Mr. Thomas is experiencing profound guilt and using our case as penance mechanism. His cooperation is tactically valuable, but emotionally motivated by self-punishment rather than principle. We should accept the assistance while recognizing the underlying psychology. He's trying to make amends for getting Jessica killed Buddy. Amends require accountability, not just confession. If he truly wants to honor Mom's memory, he'll testify against the people who gave the orders. The trial preparation consumed 6 weeks, a blur of depositions and evidence review and witness coordination that tested Jeffrey's ability to function while effectively homeless. Laura had found them an apartment, nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms in a complex that accepted month-to-month leases and didn't run credit checks. Emily arranged for Andrew to continue his education remotely, providing structure while Jeffrey navigated the labyrinth of federal prosecution. Timothy had been right about his own limitations. Civil litigation didn't prepare lawyers for the complexity of RICO prosecution against defendants with unlimited resources. They needed someone who specialized in intellectual property theft and had experience taking down corporate criminals who thought themselves untouchable. Anthony Wilson arrived in their lives through Gary Young's network, a legendary patent attorney who'd spent 40 years making corporations regret their arrogance. He was 72 and looked every day of it white-haired and weathered, but his mind remained sharp as surgical steel, and his hatred for Williams Energy burned with intensely personal fire. I lost a case against them in 1984. Young inventor, brilliant engineer, developed water purification technology that could have saved millions of lives in developing countries. Williams Energy saw military applications, stole the patents through legal manipulation, then buried the civilian applications because they weren't profitable enough. My client committed suicide 6 months after the verdict. He looked at Jeffrey with eyes that had seen too many good people destroyed by systems designed to protect the powerful. I've been waiting 30 years for another shot at Williams Energy. Your grandfather's case gives me that shot. I'll represent you pro bono, and I'll make them regret every minute of the theft they've committed. The prosecution's case was strong but not invincible. Patent theft from 5 decades ago faced statute of limitations challenges. Insurance fraud would be hard to prove without direct evidence of intent. Even Jonathan's murder remained circumstantial despite the electromagnetic pulse generator and pacemaker telemetry. But Robert Williams' deathbed confession changed everything. Miller had spent 3 weeks authenticating the recording, verifying voice patterns, confirming timestamps, ensuring chain of custody would survive courtroom scrutiny. When forensic analysis confirmed authenticity, the prosecution's strategy crystallized around a simple approach: let Robert Williams condemn himself in his own words. The technical files on Jonathan's micro SD card remained encrypted despite FBI attempts to crack them. The patent applications were readable, the financial records accessible, but Jonathan's actual engineering designs, the crown jewels that proved his technology worked, were locked behind encryption that resisted every conventional attack. Andrew spent 2 weeks studying the encrypted files looking for patterns that would reveal the decryption key. On day 14, he found it during a session where Emily was helping him process the stress through musical therapy. "It's not encryption." Andrew's voice carried the excitement he only showed when solving puzzles that had stumped everyone else. "It's encoding." Grandfather Jonathan converted his technical designs into musical notation, then rendered the musical notation as hexadecimal values. To everyone else, it looks like encrypted data, but it's actually a score written for instruments that don't exist. He demonstrated translating hex values back through musical notation into technical schematics that showed Jonathan's energy harvesting system in complete detail. Every component, every specification, every improvement developed over 50 years of refinement. The FBI's encryption specialists had been trying to crack security when they should have been reading music. Miller looked at the decoded schematics with something approaching awe. "This is genius-level obfuscation. Your grandfather created a cipher that required specific knowledge to decode. He wanted to make sure only someone who cared enough to really look would find it." Andrew was organizing the decoded files, creating indexes and cross-references with the methodical precision that made him invaluable to the prosecution team. Someone like me. The trial began on a Tuesday in October in the United States District Court for the Central District of California. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her mid-60s with a reputation for intellectual rigor and zero tolerance for legal theatrics. Williams Energy Corporation had assembled a defense team that filled 3 tables led by Margaret Walsh, a litigator whose win rate against federal prosecutors approached 70%. Donald Thomas sat at the prosecution table despite being named as a co-conspirator. His cooperation agreement required full testimony against Williams Energy and its current leadership, including board members who'd participated in the conspiracy to suppress Jonathan's technology. The prosecution's opening was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen. No relation to anyone in the case, Miller had assured them, a woman barely 40 who'd made her reputation prosecuting white-collar criminals who thought themselves beyond accountability. This case is about theft that lasted longer than most people's careers, about technology that could have helped millions but was buried to protect billions, about a man named Jonathan Wright who invented something revolutionary, had it stolen, and was murdered 50 years later when he tried to reclaim what was rightfully his. She walked the jury through the timeline: 1973 patent applications, 1974 forced partnership, decades of deliberate non-development, 1985 legal defeat, and finally 2024 murder staged to look like cardiac arrest. Each point supported by documentation, each claim backed by evidence that Walsh would have to refute through something more substantial than procedural objections. The defense's opening was exactly what Anthony Wilson had predicted: attack the timeline. Patents filed 50 years ago face statute of limitations. Business decisions from 1974 can't be judged by 2024 standards. Jonathan Wright's death was natural causes tragic, but not criminal. The electromagnetic pulse generator was never proven to have caused the pacemaker malfunction. Walsh was good. Her delivery polished, her logic superficially compelling. But she couldn't explain away Robert Williams's confession, which the prosecution planned to introduce on Day 3. Day 1 featured technical experts explaining how Jonathan's energy harvesting system worked. Day 2 brought financial analysts documenting Williams Energy's licensing revenue from technologies suspiciously similar to Jonathan's original designs. Day 3 was Robert Williams speaking from beyond the grave to condemn the empire he'd built. The recording lasted 47 minutes, and the courtroom listened in absolute silence as Robert's voice, weakened by age and illness but still commanding, described his theft in meticulous detail. I recognized immediately that Wright's technology would destroy the utility monopoly model. Distributed energy generation removes the choke point we control. So I did what was necessary to protect the business my father built and my grandfather before him. I stole Jonathan Wright's patents through legal coercion, buried the technology in a subsidiary I could control, and ensured that nobody else could develop it while our exclusive license remained in effect. He described the 1985 lawsuit, the the manufactured legal arguments that had convinced a judge to rule against Jonathan, despite the overwhelming evidence of contractual violation. He detailed the monitoring of Jessica Davis after she married Jeffrey Lewis, the decision to delay her medical coverage when she started investigating Jonathan's case, the cold calculation that led to her death. Jessica Thomas Davis was a threat to our interests. Not a major threat, but threats must be eliminated before they grow. I authorized delays in her insurance approvals until the cancer spread beyond treatment. Plausible deniability through bureaucratic process. It's how civilized people commit murder. The jury's faces showed horror, disgust, anger, exactly the reaction prosecutors needed. Walsh objected repeatedly on grounds of hearsay and authentication, but Morrison overruled each objection with terse citations of exceptions that allowed deathbed confessions as evidence. When Robert's recording reached Jonathan's murder, Donald Thomas broke down crying at the prosecution table. The sound of a father grieving his complicity in his daughter's death echoed through the courtroom, and even Walsh seemed shaken by the raw human pain interrupting legal procedure. Jonathan Wright refused to sell the property that contained his original prototypes and research, refused to sign away rights that would have let us sanitize the location before his death triggered probate. So I authorized the installation of an electromagnetic pulse generator near his pacemaker charging station. The device, activated when he was alone, caused cascade failure of his cardiac management system. Death appeared natural, and we had time to remove evidence before inheritance could transfer the property to his grandson. The recording ended with Robert's voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent his life accumulating power only to discover it had cost him his humanity. I regret nothing except that I'm dying before I can see what Jonathan's technology could have become if I'd let it develop naturally. That's my only regret, curiosity about the road not taken. Everything else I did, I'd do again to protect what's mine. The courtroom remained silent for 10 seconds after the recording ended. Then Morrison called recess, and the jury filed out looking like people who'd witnessed something that changed their understanding of how the world worked. Anthony Wilson's cross-examination of Donald Thomas on day 4 was brutal and necessary, establishing that Donald had participated in Jessica's murder through willful blindness and bureaucratic delay. But Donald didn't flinch from accountability, didn't try to minimize his role or shift blame to dead men. He admitted everything, provided documentation for every claim, and turned state's evidence with the thoroughness of someone seeking punishment rather than redemption. Walsh tried to discredit him as a desperate man trading testimony for reduced charges, but the documentary evidence backed every word he said. Williams Energy's current CEO took the stand and denied knowledge of historical wrongdoing, claimed ignorance of Robert's confession, insisted the company operated within legal boundaries. Then the prosecution introduced internal emails from the CEO's own account discussing how to manage the right situation and ensure probate complications prevent evidence discovery. Walsh objected, the CEO stammered, and Morrison sustained the objection on procedural grounds, while the jury absorbed the implication current leadership knew and participated in the cover-up. Andrew testified on day 6, and Jeffrey watched his son walk to the witness stand with the careful deliberation he brought to unfamiliar social situations. The prosecutor had prepared him extensively, but Andrew's testimony didn't need preparation. He simply explained what he'd found, how he'd decoded it, why it mattered. Grandfather Jonathan's designs weren't theoretical. They were fully engineered systems ready for manufacturing. The fact that Williams Energy never developed them despite having exclusive rights proves deliberate suppression. The financial analysis shows they earned $340 million licensing patents derived from his original work while preventing him from benefiting from his own inventions. Walsh's cross-examination tried to rattle him rapid-fire questions designed to confuse, but Andrew processed each query with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. Isn't it possible Williams Energy determined the technology wasn't commercially viable? No. The licensing revenue demonstrates commercial viability. They monetize the technology while preventing commercialization. You're 9 years old. How can you possibly understand complex corporate strategy? I'm 9 years old with documented pattern recognition abilities that exceed adult norms. Age doesn't determine analytical capacity. Evidence does. The jury tried to hide smiles. Walsh tried different angles, but Andrew remained unshakable, treating her questions as puzzles to be solved rather than attacks to be defended against. The verdict came on day 9 after 4 hours of deliberation. Morrison read it with the flat affect of someone who'd seen too many trials to be surprised by outcomes. But Jeffrey thought he detected satisfaction under the professional neutrality. On the charge of conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft, guilty. On the charge of racketeering, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud leading to wrongful death, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. Williams Energy Corporation was fined $340 million and ordered to dissolve within 18 months, its assets distributed to settle civil claims from victims of its decades-long campaign of technology suppression. Individual board members faced criminal charges that would be prosecuted separately. Donald Thomas received immunity in exchange for testimony, but would face civil liability for Jessica's death. The patents reverted to Jeffrey as Jonathan's heir, along with a $15 million settlement from Williams Energy's remaining assets. Less than the $127 million Jeffrey might have won in pure damages, but enough to change their lives permanently. Anthony Wilson met them outside the courthouse, looking more satisfied than Jeffrey had seen him during the entire trial. This doesn't bring back my client from 1984, but it proves something I'd stopped believing, that sometimes the system works when people refuse to let it fail. 6 months passed before Jeffrey fully understood what winning meant. The money helped no more motel rooms, no more choosing between food and electricity. But money wasn't the transformation that mattered. The patents presented a choice: license them for maximum profit or release them for maximum impact. Jeffrey spent weeks wrestling with the decision, running numbers that showed how licensing could generate generational wealth, set Andrew up for life, fund every therapy and educational opportunity his son would ever need. Then he remembered Jonathan's video, the part about fighting not for wealth, but for what was right. Remembered Jessica's promise to help families achieve energy independence. Remembered that some things mattered more than survival. He open-sourced the patents under Creative Commons licensing that allowed any manufacturer to build Jonathan's systems, provided they sold at or below cost ceilings that kept the technology affordable for average families. Profits beyond the ceiling had to go to the right foundation, established to help low-income families install the systems for free. 20 manufacturers took the license within the first month. By month 6, over 5,000 families had installed systems that cut their electrical costs by 70% or more. The technology worked exactly as Jonathan had designed it, harvesting ambient electromagnetic energy and converting it to usable power with efficiency that shocked even the engineers who built it. The farmhouse became the Wright Technology Museum, dedicated to preserving Jonathan's legacy and educating the public about the 50-year theft that had delayed energy independence for millions. Jeffrey served as curator, a position that required no credentials except lived experience and understanding that some stories deserved telling, even when telling them was painful. Emily visited weekly, helping Andrew adjust to life where the constant crisis had been replaced by something approaching stability. She and Jeffrey had developed a relationship that was more than friendship, but less than romance. Two damaged people learning to trust again through shared purpose rather than desperate need. Laura had lost her family, but gained self-respect. Patricia refused all contact after Donald's testimony, choosing loyalty to Robert's memory over acknowledgement of what that loyalty had cost. But Laura seemed lighter without the weight of family expectations, free to be someone whose worth wasn't measured in wealth or connections. On a Saturday in April, Jeffrey stood in Jonathan's restored workshop teaching Andrew how to solder components for the updated energy harvester they were building together. The boy's hands were steady, his focus absolute, his understanding of the electronics deeper than Jeffrey's, despite the 40-year age gap. The work they did mattered. Not because it would make them rich, they'd chosen a different path, but because every system they helped install was a family freed from dependence on the very companies that had stolen this freedom in the first place. "Are you proud of what we did, Dad?" The question came without warning, and Jeffrey paused with the soldering iron halfway to the circuit board. "Yeah, buddy, I'm proud. Not because we won, but because we fought for something bigger than ourselves." Grandfather Jonathan spent 50 years protecting this technology. Mom tried to help him and died for it. We could have taken the money and walked away. But we didn't. No, we didn't. Jeffrey thought about the choices that had led here, the moments when surrender had seemed rational and resistance looked like suicide. We chose purpose over profit, and some days I wonder if that was stupid. Andrew looked up, made eye contact for 3 full seconds, a gift of connection he rarely gave. It wasn't stupid. It was the only choice that honored everyone who fought before us. Grandfather Jonathan didn't leave us money. He left us purpose. Using it for anything less would have betrayed his sacrifice. The words hit Jeffrey with the force of truth he'd been circling around for months. Jonathan hadn't died protecting patents for their commercial value. He'd died protecting the principle that innovation should serve humanity rather than enrich monopolies. Choosing profit over open source would have made Jeffrey wealthy, but would have proven that the system won after all, that everything could be bought if the price was high enough. The workshop door opened and Emily appeared with a box of parts they'd ordered for community installations. Behind her, the late afternoon sun painted the farmhouse in colors that made it look almost beautiful, despite the scars of neglect not yet fully repaired. This was the life they'd built from the ashes of the one that had burned down. Not the life Jeffrey would have chosen if given the option 3 years ago, but maybe better for being chosen by necessity rather than preference. Andrew would never be typical, would always struggle with social connection and sensory overload, and the 1,000 small challenges that came with neurological difference. But he'd also always have this gift for seeing patterns in chaos, for finding truth in data, for solving puzzles that stumped everyone else. And Jeffrey would never be the person he was before Jessica's death, before the eviction notice, before the inheritance that had saved and complicated their lives in equal measure. But he'd become someone who understood that losing everything could be the beginning of finding what actually mattered. The Wright Foundation's first annual report showed impact that numbers couldn't fully capture: 5,247 installations across 12 states. Average energy cost reduction of 68%. 3 manufacturing facilities employing workers in communities that had lost factories to automation, and a waiting list of families who wanted independence from utility monopolies that had held them hostage for generations. Jeffrey read the report to Andrew over dinner in their modest apartment, the space they'd chosen, not because they couldn't afford better, but because enough space was enough, and excess was the disease they'd been vaccinated against through suffering. "We changed things, buddy. Not the whole world, but enough of it to matter." Andrew was eating with the careful precision he brought to physical tasks, organizing his food by texture and temperature. Grandfather Jonathan would be proud. Mom would be proud. I'm proud. The simple declaration from a child who rarely expressed emotion carried weight that flowery speeches couldn't match. Jeffrey looked at his son, this brilliant, damaged, extraordinary boy who'd helped topple an empire through pattern recognition and stubborn refusal to accept that power always won, and felt the kind of pride that parents feel when they realize their children have become better than they dared hope. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer terrifying. Andrew would face challenges that specialized education and patient teachers could only partially address. Jeffrey would navigate single parenthood and curator duties and the ongoing work of helping families access technology that should never have been buried. Emily would be part of their lives in ways they were still defining: friend and ally, and maybe eventually more. But tonight, in this moment, they had enough, had fought for something that mattered, and won against odds that should have crushed them, had honored the legacy of people who died protecting truth when lies would have been easier and more profitable. Jeffrey Lewis had inherited many things from Jonathan Wright: patents worth millions, a farmhouse full of history, documentary evidence of 50 years of corporate crime. But the most valuable inheritance wasn't measurable in currency or real estate. It was the understanding that some fights were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible, because losing while standing for what was right mattered more than winning through compromise with what was wrong. and sometimes, just sometimes, refusing to surrender actually worked.